Hey gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and I'm so excited to bring you an interview with David Thompson, designer of Pavlov's house. How are you doing, David?
I'm good. How are you?
I am alright, and so for those of us who have not played Pavlov's house, do you want to introduce the game really quickly for us?
Yeah, sure. So, like you said, it's obviously a solitaire game, right? So, in this case, it's 1 to 3 players, but really it's designed primarily as solitaire or co-op. Pavlov's house was the name of a location in Stalingrad, so it takes place during the Battle of Stalingrad, World War II. And as the solitaire or co-op players, you take the role of the Soviet soldiers who defended this single apartment building against German attack for a couple of months. So that's the goal of the game, is to hold out for a couple of months against constant attack.
Yes, and this game is intense, and it is your first solo game, is that right? Your first
That's
solo
right.
design?
Yep.
So, do you solo game yourself?
Yeah, so I actually don't do a whole lot of gaming at all. And the reason is because I'm either at work doing dad duty or designing, right? So
How
almost all
dare
of my
you?
yeah, I know. So most of my gaming, and especially most of my solo gaming, is design work. And then when I am doing any other gaming, it's usually with my kids. So, but I do some for sure, right? Mostly lighter stuff. But like Space Core, which just came out recently, is fantastic, and I've been soloing that. So there are exceptions, but yeah.
Alright, any other favorite solo games you want to plug since we're here?
Oh goodness. Let's see. Well, what else would I say? I mean, just simple stuff like there's a game called Airborne Commander, which is a great super light card game,
Alright.
and then like classics like Friday and stuff are just awesome, right? Like something you could just grab at lunch or something and pull out. Yeah.
And Pavlov's House is also your first published war game.
Yep.
So
That's right.
you've published a number of games in other sort of genres. What has led you to wargaming recently?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I started designing games seriously about 5 years ago, and around the same time I moved to England. And so when I moved to England, one of the first things I did was take a trip to Normandy, right? So it was around this time I had started flirting with a different design for a game that's coming out soon. But that really, like, I mean, I went from like 0 to 60 with war, just like military history overnight. And so during that period, I started researching different things, and I slowly, one thing led to another, and I started really hanging out in the war game forums on Board Game Geek, which led me to a design competition, which is where I designed Castle Itter.
Oh wow. Okay, and so Castle Itter just funded on Kickstarter,
Yep,
and
that's right.
so I backed it. I'm excited to get it. But
Thank you.
so basically, you discovered a historical passion, and that passion has led you to this
That's right.
set of games that you've been designing.
That's right. Exactly.
That is really interesting. Okay, so you did a lot of research for Pavlov's House, so much so that you actually wrote a companion book for it. Did you expect your research of this game to get that intense?
No, so here's the thing. So I did Castle Litter first, which was much more straightforward from a research perspective. And when I was done with that, I asked on Board Game Geek, I was like, hey, what should I do next? And a lot of people gave me ideas, and one of those was Pablo's house. And so I started researching it. What I found was there, so most of what was known about Pavlov's house came from either the German account, which obviously is very one-sided, or Soviet propaganda. And so what you have is like this actual story that's not really told almost anywhere. And I just thought it was a really cool story, and so much of the game was based on that that I started keeping design notes, and then that turned into the history, right? And I thought it was important to tell the story for players so they really understand what's going on in the game.
So I find it really interesting that you bring this up. So one of my favorite parts of your companion book is the part where you're talking about trying to separate reality from propaganda. Do you actually
Right.
feel that you've designed a game that sort of offers your own perspective on history?
Yeah, it's interesting. So what I tried to do, and hopefully I was able to accomplish this, is there's things like who actually was even in charge of the house, right? So if you look at the game, it offers you the ability to kind of play. You will definitely be able to recreate history, regardless of how it was actually historical, because I provide all of those different opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
And so I try to present hopefully the most objective view possible based on as many primary sources. and then just leave it up to the players. Hey, who do you want to let lead the defense?
Interesting. So in terms of people being in the house, I noticed. So you made some comments that indicated that some people had actually been kind of almost erased from the history of the house, including, for
Yeah,
example, the forward observers who were
right.
coordinating with artillery across the river. Um, so how did you end up kind of discovering that they were there? What kind of led to your inclusion of less celebrated people in your game?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So, fortunately, after the end of the Cold War, Russia opened up a lot of its universities, et cetera, to the Western world for the first time, and so we were able to access a lot of some original material that we hadn't been able to use in the past. And during that same time period, a couple of authors did some interviews with people who were actually there, to include forward observers who were actually in the house. And what actually was came to be revealed was that calling in artillery strikes against the attackers was actually a very important part of the defense. But that didn't fit the propaganda, right? Because the Soviet propaganda was there was these riflemen that held out by themselves with no help, and that's just totally not the case. They were resupplied. There was all sorts of artillery help, all sorts of things that were going on that facilitated them holding out.
All right, so like the idea of the lone gunman or whatever is propagandistically likable, but it's not realistic.
Exactly right. That's right.
So, have you had anyone challenge your perspective on Pavlov's house? Has anybody played your game and felt that you didn't represent history well, or like wanted to challenge your viewpoint?
No, no, not at all. And if they did, I would not purport to be a scholar, right? So what I would say is, hey, let's just take a look at the sources and see, and we'll see what happens. But I certainly wouldn't say that it is the truth, right? It is what seems to be correct based on a variety of sources.
Although I think what I like about this a lot, especially, is that I like the idea of a game telling a version
Right,
of a historical truth
right,
because I like that you can argue about history through making it happen in a board game.
right. Yep, absolutely.
So I actually looked at your bibliography in your companion thing. Do you read Russian?
I don't read, so I can kind of read it a little bit. I certainly don't speak it at all. There was a lot of machine translation, and there was a lot of calling in friends, like phone a friend, hey, can you help me out? So yeah, because there were a couple of sources that were by people who were in the house at the time, and I thought that was important to get those firsthand accounts.
Yeah. So what is the most interesting thing that you learned that wouldn't necessarily be reflected in the game?
Ooh, that's a good question. That the defense of the house actually doesn't end when the game ends or when the Soviets said it did. So what actually happens is all the defenders are ordered to go storm a different building, and they all go out and they mostly get wiped out. And that's what actually ends the propaganda end of Pavlov's house defense, and that's what
Mm-hmm.
ends the game. But in reality, they regrouped. Pavlov himself was injured. Lots of guys were injured and killed. And the defense of the house continued on until the Soviets fought back and took Stalingrad.
That's really interesting. So the storm groups that you can play as throughout the game, um,
Right.
do those all represent actual events or just sort of potential events that might have happened as people in Stalingrad were fighting over choice territory within the city?
Yeah. So those were all actual buildings that were taken or attempted by the Soviets. They were not all buildings that were taken by the defenders of Pavlov's house necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
So if you go and you look at in the very back of the book, I have like all the different units that participated to the defense,
Yeah.
and some of those were only sort of tangentially related. Those units were the ones involved with all the storm group assaults. And so, that right there is probably the biggest stretch of the game as far as historicity is the defenders of Pavlov's house being involved with all those storm group assaults.
Interesting. So one other little historical touch that makes Pavlov's house special is a lot of the tokens for Soviet soldiers who are in the house have actual images
Right.
of, so there's not pictures of everybody, but there are pictures of some people. Were those straightforward image identifications, or was it actually kind of hard sometimes to tell who's who or find pictures of various soldiers involved?
Most of them were easy. There were a couple that were actually mislabeled, and it took a lot of reconciliation to figure out who was actually who. But I would say probably 80% of them were pretty straightforward. Single source, and a couple of different sources validated it. But yeah, there were a couple of people that were really difficult to try to get at.
So, for you, is doing that historical research part of the pleasure of designing a game like this?
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely, yeah. I didn't realize it would be right. When it began as a means to an end. Like, hey, I don't. And here's the truth of it all. You know, you don't really want to design a war game for war gamers because they are going to almost certainly know it better than you do, the material. So I'm terrified of getting it wrong. So it's really like, oh, I better do a really good job researching it so I don't get called out. But that turned into just really loving it, loving the process.
That's fantastic. Okay, so the other thing that's interesting about Pavlov's House, and speaking of historical research, is that it's now ended up as the first in a Valiant Defense series of games. So do you want to talk about what that series is meant to communicate and embody as an experience for players?
Yep, absolutely. So, I mean, it is absolutely designed to demonstrate sort of the courage of like the last stand, or these, against all odds type. And the first design in the series was actually Castle Itter, but the first published was Pavlov's House. So it's kind of funny how it worked out that way. In the series, I'm not necessarily constrained by time period or whatever, but it's always going to be about sort of a small group of people probably holding out against a much larger force, against odds that are not in their favor.
So what has attracted you to that style of battle as something to recreate in a game?
I think that I really enjoy like the human story, right? The size. And so like you mentioned the counters, it's important for me to be able to relate to as close to an individual level with each of the defenders as possible. So in the case of Pavlov's House or Castle Itter or the next game that I'm working on, down to individual counters and understanding those stories and how each defender contributed.
So do you feel like researching the story of Castle Itter was more straightforward than researching Pavlov's House?
Yes, absolutely. And thankfully it was the first one, right? It was because there's one primary source in this case, really. There's one book that kind of tells the story. And that's both a pro and a con, right? Because I'm largely limited to one author's view of the story. And there's tons of, I did go and find some original articles at the time and some other sources, but it's probably 90% of the backstory of the game came from one book in this case.
Interesting. So Pavlov's House also represented a big leap for you in terms of the kind of legwork that you were doing yourself as part of game development.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So very different experience, because the partnership I have with DVG is unlike any other game that I've done. Right. So I did the design, the development, all the art, so everything basically, and DVG is doing all the publishing and of course the customer service and stuff, which is a very different relationship than I have with any other publisher.
That's interesting. Okay, so the next game in the series is called Soldiers in Postmen's Uniforms. Is that right?
So kind of. And then what I mean by that is soldiers. So when I first started working on the series, it wasn't a series, and Pavlov's House was with DVG, and Soldiers in Postmen's Uniform had already been signed by Phalanx.
Ooh,
so
okay.
It uses the same system. It's very similar, but it technically won't be part of the same system because it won't be published by DVG.
Gotcha. But wasn't Castle Itter also signed by another publisher, and that's why it wasn't the one that came out first?
That's right. Yeah. So it was with Victory Point Games for a few years, and once it expired, the contract expired. I just went to DVG, and they were super excited about doing another game in the series.
Gotcha. So, is there anything else that you can tell us about the next game in the series?
I haven't mentioned this to anybody, so I think what I'll do is, because I can't get it out of my mind, I'm obsessed with it, is the Battle of Martine, which is it is sort of the extreme southern extent of Normandy, and it was during the U.S. Invasion, right, during World War II.
Hmm.
So it's another really exciting sort of, a group is cut off. It's one of the massive German counteroffensives. So you'll have a position that'll be, Americans holding out against the German attack. And the reason I'm obsessed with that one is my grandfather was in the 30th Infantry Division. He was there
Mm.
at the Battle of Martine. It's something I've studied a lot. And so I kind of wanted to not do it. Like I was looking for other things, and I'm just obsessed, and I keep coming back to it. So I kind of need to get it out of my system, and then I can look at, some potential other options.
All right. No, that sounds fantastic. So is that battle also sort of a big part of your family lore? Like, did you grow up kind of thinking
Not
a lot about
necessarily
that
that,
one?
yeah, not necessarily that battle specifically, but just my grandfather's
Hmm.
time with the 30th Infantry Division. So he went from basically Normandy until the end of the war.
Wow. And so is this partially why World War II seems to be your area of historical focus?
So yeah, I mean, I would say my favorite history, like the military history periods, would be Cold War / post Cold War,
Hmm.
from a political perspective.
Right.
World War One, certainly number one, and also I'm a big fan of the French and Indian War. But the other issue is when I talk to people about designing games, especially in this series, like I mentioned, it needs to be a small enough scale that you can get down to the individual defenders,
Right.
but it needs to be recent enough that you can get detailed information about them.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
I don't feel comfortable doing games about people that are still alive. And so
Okay.
my window is really, really small about games that kind of work. And it just happens that World War II has tons and tons and tons of material to work with, right? So it's a good sweet spot, but I'm not limited to that.
Interesting. So, what are some potential battles from other wars that might fit your parameters, or have you started looking?
So the one that I would be really interested to do, have you ever seen The Siege of Jadotville, which is it's like a Netflix original movie?
No.
It's in the 1950s, and it was a Irish unit that was in Africa, and they're defending a small area. So it would work really well with the system.
Hmm.
It's almost old enough to probably be okay. There's a couple of guys that are still alive. It's just a really cool story. So you should check that out because the movie's really good too. It's a really
All
good
right.
movie on the
And
topic.
what's the title again?
Siege of Jadotville.
All right.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
what makes you? I mean, I can see why this would be right, but what specifically makes you uncomfortable about designing games about events where some of the witnesses are still alive?
Yeah, it just hits close to home because I work with military. I mean, I'm prior military, work with
Hmm.
military still. I just wouldn't feel comfortable basing it on um, guys that I could conceivably have worked with, right?
That's fair. That's fair. Do you
Yeah.
expect that maybe you'll hear from family members or from people who kind of celebrate family histories like yours down the line in relation to games that you've made?
Yeah, maybe, right? So obviously, the more games I design that have a Western, like, Pavlov's House is almost certainly unlikely, but maybe with Castle Litter or with
Hmm.
the Moritane game or something, uh, potentially, right? So with Soldiers and Postmen's Uniform, I'm actually working with a guy who's doing a lot of the historical research. We met in Gdansk in Poland to do the initial research, and he's got some family ties to the game, right? So we'll see.
Oh, that's super interesting.
Yeah.
So, do you work with research partners on other games, or is this also a first for you in terms of development and design? And
Yeah, so this will be the first. There's one other partnership I have going, and it's about a Italian human torpedo game, which is not defense. It's totally different, right? So,
oh,
so one other sort of historical partner, if you will. So,
that's awesome.
yeah. Now on the non-war game side, most of my designs are co-designs.
Yeah, yeah. I've
Yeah.
noticed that you've actually done a huge variety of different types of games.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
so, do you feel like that's something that's going to continue for you, or do you feel like you've really hit your stride with wargaming and that's where you want to be and you've like found your voice or something?
Yeah, I would say that I won't stop doing other designs, right? If there's co-designers that want to work with me and they have an idea, or if I happen to have something, But I would say that wargaming's probably it's the primary focus for sure.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
All right. So, is there anything you'd like to add? I know that Castle Eater is coming up soon. Or do you have any other games that are in the pipeline?
Yeah. So let's think about this. So I have one that's coming out soon from Phalanx that is called Europe Divided, and it's all about post-Cold War, sort of the battle for Central and Eastern Europe, between Western Europe and Russia, right? So think post-Cold War, think European expansion, NATO and EU expansion, and then resurgent Russia. So that's coming out. I don't know. It'll be on Kickstarter from Phalanx in probably the next few months.
All right.
And then at Gen Con, I'll have a game called Undaunted, which is a deck building sort of light war game. So 2-player deck building game. Yep.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. Is it going to solo?
No, so there is no solo option. So I've been asked. It's like, man, maybe I'll go back and try it because and there's one other game actually that's I've just been talking about recently on the war game Facebook pages and stuff, and it's a post-apocalyptic war game that is 2-player but also solos, right? So I'm working on the solo system now for that, and actually that was my first ever design. That was a game I had started designing before I even started getting into gaming. So
really,
yeah. So it's been in work for literally about 10 years. I mean,
oh wow! Does it feel interesting to go back to one of your early projects and kind of rework it? And now that you know what you know now,
yeah, totally reworked. I mean, it's like completely morphed, and then I brought a lot of wargaming sensibilities to it. So, yeah, it's totally different. But yeah, I'm working now on the solo system, so trying to integrate that.
All right. So actually, one thing I have noticed about Pavlov's House is that I'm not a war gamer. I'm a solo gamer who will play anything that solos, and I found Pavlov's House to be very accessible. Is that something that you were deliberately going for? What other kinds of games are you sort of mixing in to make your war games have that feeling?
Yeah, Pavlov's House is an interesting one because I specifically wanted the co-op experience to feel super asymmetric for the two people that were co-oping it, right? So on one side, you have a very resource management. Like if you're playing the operational side, that's not a war game at all, right? You're doing all this resource management. So yeah, I don't, I try to borrow across genres whenever possible. And I would say I'm a Waro primarily, if you know that term, which is like war game Euro hybrid.
Okay.
Right. That's my happy spot when I'm playing. So I'm definitely a big fan of reaching across the two to kind of blend when possible.
That is really interesting. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, David. I really appreciate that you have come on here to talk to us about your game, about the research that goes into it. I'm sure that my viewers do too. Guys, feel free to leave questions for us in the comments. And again, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I had a good time.
Happy gaming, guys.